thanks to be here. Just to keep something in mind, the alpha disappears in our model. Okay, the gamma, we don't have a gamma though. Okay, so this is a paper Jonathan Chiu at the Bank of Canada. There's a disclaimer down there, okay, which we have to put up there, just to hedge our bet that nobody is accusing the Bank of Canada to make outrageous statements. Okay, perfect. So what's our paper about? We have a very simple question, okay? How well can a cryptocurrency serve as a means of payment? Okay, good, and we want to answer that question. So how are we going to do this? We have arrived at the macro side of economics, okay? So what we're going to develop is a general equilibrium model, and I'm going to be specific in a second what I mean with general equilibrium, because everything is kind of interlinked in our model, okay, of a bilateral and monetary exchange, okay, where we have three important features. The first feature is the payment system works via blockchain, okay? I'm not going to talk more about that, but really what we have in mind is Nakamoto consensus here, because we're going to have the blockchain being updated by a proof of work protocol, okay? Importantly, in the... Okay, I thought I have a loud voice. Usually I shout too much, so I try to be close and I'm not walking that much then. Good. So what we basically going to do is proof of work with blockchain. Importantly, we're going to model explicitly that this proof of work protocol is going to be financed by two things, by transaction fees and by seigniorage, okay? And they feed back into the proof of work protocol. They're going to be burned, and that's going to be the cost in the system, okay? So we're going to explicitly model these costs in the system. Good. And the problem is we need a particular proof of work protocol, and we need enough resources that are being spent on this proof of work protocol, because there's an incentive problem to cheat, okay? And the incentive problem to cheat comes from double spending, okay? And all these three features here basically together with this bilateral model of monetary exchange feed into each other, okay? And then give a holistic view. That's what we label in economics as a general equilibrium view, how well basically a blockchain-based payment system can actually work, a la Bitcoin. So that's the thing we're doing. So what are the results? So the first is kind of a conceptual result. So what we're going to do is we're trying to get close to what we know how to do economics. So if you think about design, we think about this as a mechanism design. And so in a mechanism design world, you have to provide incentives to people to behave in the correct way. And again, so what we are deriving here, really in the tradition of the economics literature, we're going to go down and write down the cost of the system via an incentive constraint that nobody's going to cheat, okay? And this, since cheating basically takes the form of double spending, we developed something which is called a no double spending constraint that depends on the proof of work protocol and how hard the competition essentially is in this proof of work protocol. Okay, good. Then we're going to do something. The next step in our agenda is then we're going to look basically at the question how you optimally raise the revenue for the proof of work protocol, and we're going to arrive simply from an economics point of view, and there could be other dimensions here, so I want to hatch a little bit already. We're going to arrive at the fact that it turns out that seigniorage is much better than fees, okay? If you have to raise revenues in a long run situation, you want to basically do exactly the opposite what Bitcoin is proposing, and there's going to be a clear economic intuition for that. Good. The third thing is we're going to do a silly, crazy exercise, and we're going to arrive at some point estimates. But don't get too hung up with these numbers, because the numbers are a little bit fudgy in a sense, but it gives you a ballpark figure. How inefficient basically a payment system would be if you run it via the Bitcoin protocol. And so there are two numbers that I put up there. It's 500 times and 65 times. As I said, don't get too hung up on the exact numbers, but these are large in a sense that if I compare them with a regular currency system, right now the 500 times corresponds to a situation of about 2 years ago, because we calibrate the model to 2016, okay, for several reasons. That refers to the 500 one, and the 65 would be kind of an optimal long-run system, okay, how Bitcoin, the cost in an optimally designed revenue structure in Bitcoin, okay, good. Excellent. But that gives you just a rough estimate, okay? Good, excellent. So what are we going to do? So I just want to put up this slide because it explains you the economics that goes on how to avoid the double spending problem. I think everybody kind of understands the double spending problem here, okay? So think about a transaction between a buyer and a seller, okay? A buyer wants to buy a good for Bitcoin, and there's already two circles that are crossed out with these red crosses, okay? But this would be a normal transaction. So what you would do is, as the seller, you would say like, okay, I accept the transaction. I'm going to deliver the good to you, conditional on seeing the transaction and you supplying the Bitcoin to me. As long as I see this reflected in the blockchain, okay, in an update, I'm going to supply the good, all right? So in the upper line, you're going to see basically the good is supplied, the blockchain is updated. So how do you cheat against that? You cheat against that by basically the buyer either hiring a miner or starting mining himself and tries to mine an alternative history. Now, in order to basically steal the good, because he would not pay if he is successful, he has to do the following. He has to mine the block secretly, and he cannot announce the block before actually the seller is fooled in supplying the good by seeing the blockchain updated. Once the blockchain is updated, you can reclaim basically your payment by announcing along a chain, okay? So that's the double spending idea here. So there's two ways how you can actually avoid, the seller can basically avoid this problem of being defrauded in two ways. Number one, this is it's privately costly to basically require more confirmations in the blockchain. So think about really a high-value transaction. You don't want to be defrauded on that. Think about somebody buys, I don't know, 10 Ferraris or something like that, okay? So you would require lots of confirmations in a row before you deliver the good. That way you can protect yourself because it's fairly hard, basically, to secretly mine for a long period of time. Think about it like this. The second dimension here is a socially costly dimension. This is you can make transaction much safer the more you induce actually competition for updating the blockchain. So we have heard a lot of these mining models already, and what is important is that you have a fairly high hash rate, because if you have a fairly high hash rate of people that behave appropriately and mining truthfully in this particular world, it makes it very hard to beat them and basically announcing a particular fork. And it's these two elements that interact and give me basically a handle on these incentive constraints so that nobody starts double spending, because it's just irrational to do so. Okay? So there's nothing about, a consensus problem that we are modeling here, that by chance there's different blocks, there's a malicious attack, that basically you just want to bring the network down, nothing like this. We're just looking at purely the economic incentives here, okay, of defrauding people through double spending on this particular blockchain. Good. That's the idea. So why general equilibrium, okay? So I put this slide up to basically give you an idea of what we're doing in a simple diagram. So I don't have funny pictures. This is basically the only picture I have, okay? But I think it's very important to understand this. So Bitcoin, or any monetary system at the end of the day, is a reinforcing system, okay? So if you think about this, if you start out, you only will be willing to accept Bitcoin as a payment if you think that Bitcoin is a secure means of payment, okay? All right, if you accept Bitcoin, the more people accept Bitcoin, the higher is the value of the currency itself, because you can use it as a medium of exchange, okay? The value will go up. If it's very valuable, you can actually provide rewards to mining, because all the mining rewards are actually paid in Bitcoin itself. So you're going to have lots of mining going on. But if you have lots of mining going on in this particular world, okay, then this becomes safer, the system. Why? Because if there's a harder competition for updating the blockchain, it's much harder to beat this competition, okay? So the incentives to double spend go down, which again increases the security in the system, which means people find it attractive to accept it as a means of payment. It pins down in the value and so forth, okay? So that's kind of the idea. And that's what I mean by general equilibrium. It can also run the other way. So in our model, for example, we have two equilibria where basically Bitcoin is worthless and nobody uses it as a means of exchange. That's well known in the monetary literature. You always get multiple equilibria. Okay? Good. But we're not looking at the bad equilibrium. We're looking at the good equilibrium, because we just want to get a handle on how well it can function. All right? And if you have any pressing questions, just interrupt me. Okay? No problem. Excellent. Perfect. So there's a lot in this paper in terms of, the nuts and bolts, and I'm not going to show you the exact general equilibrium version here. I'm just going to give you really the basics in terms of how to derive these incentive constraints and how to get a handle on why exchange in Bitcoin is really expensive, okay? Good, excellent. So look at this timeline. This is a particular stylized version of what's going on in a transaction, okay? So you have a buyer and a seller. There's a double coincidence of one problem, like Linda has talked a lot about and stuff like that. So that's all in the background, slightly differently executed, but that's fine. And so what the buyer has to do is, in order to buy a good, he has to offer a contract. And this contract consists of three things. He will say, I want to buy an amount X of goods, and you have to pay me D in terms of Bitcoin for that. And I'm willing to wait, but you have to deliver this in N periods to me. And the N periods is basically equivalent to saying after N confirmations in the block. That's the idea, okay? So let's look at preferences. Let's look at payoffs, okay? So importantly, all the things that are in red here basically signal costs of exchange, all right? So let's go over the first one. The buyer gets a particular utility UX. Never mind about the epsilon. I'm not going to talk about it at all in this talk. UX is kind of the utility he gets for it. He has to make a payment, and that's just quasi-linear because it's easier to handle mathematically. So minus D is the payment. But the key thing here is he does not like postponed consumption of the good. That's this delta to the power of N. So delta is less than 1. The longer he waits, the more losses he incurs. Okay? Good. So he wants to have a fast settling transaction. If you think about payment system, you want to have a fast settling transaction. Okay? Good. So that's the first cost. So if he wants to have a safe transaction, he has to wait. Good. The second one is the payoff for the seller. Okay? And you make that the buyer makes it take it or leave it offer. So all the surplus goes to the buyer. The seller is just indifferent participating or not. Okay? So then what's going on here is the X is the production costs. We make it fully linear. And D is the payment. Now the payment is not going one for one to the seller because the seller faces certain costs. Okay? He's paid in Bitcoin. Number one, he has to pay transaction fees. And we have a shortcut here for the purpose in the paper. We decentralize these transaction fees that actually the buyer and the seller decide on how much transaction fees they're going to place. But here we just make it a distortionary tax. Okay? Very much like the tax that Linda has talked about. So 1 minus tau is the tax. And as you know a little bit of economics, whenever you have basically a distortionary tax, there's a alpha loss, essentially. People want to, if they face a tax, they don't want to work as hard. They want to basically not consume as much, okay? So that's one cost. The second cost is this little mu, okay? Beta over mu just is basically an effective discount factor. The seller has to wait 1 period before he can cash in on the Bitcoin holdings that he earns. That's number one. But there's also inflation. And inflation in economics is nothing else than a tax on real balances. The fact that you basically have to hold cash to make transactions, if the amount of cash grows over time, you're facing what is called inflation, which is just a tax. Okay? So these are the costs. Perfect. Excellent. Good. So now how do we do the proof of work protocol? It's pretty much like what everybody else, the I.O. papers in the session early on have done. It's just basically a Knorr game. What do I mean by that? There's a particular reward that you get for a block. It's R. Okay? You choose a particular investment in mining, which is QI. Okay, your objective function is then you maximize your expected profit from mining. Rho QI is just the expected, it's just the probability of winning the mining contest, conditional on investing QI. Okay, so this particular probability, we have some background information, some micro foundation as everybody else. It's essentially an exponential race. So your probability of winning is just your investment as a proportion to the total investment that pins down your probability. That's a standard model. I don't want to talk about this. You have seen the results in your paper, for example, as well. So what we basically going to see is that if we have perfect competition in this mining, so with that, we're working with that because it gives us very easy closed form solution. But basically, higher rewards of mining give you a higher investment into mining, and that's exactly the channel that makes basically mining, the blockchain safe, okay? And if M goes to infinity, basically every single dollar that's offered as a reward goes up in hot air in terms of smoke, okay? Because you just burn it, all right? The key issue here is, and you haven't seen that in any of the other papers, is that everything is linked here. These rewards are endogenous, okay? So if you basically want to raise more rewards, you have to offer more seigniorage, or you have to charge higher transaction fees, aka higher congestion. Okay, so you see already a trade-off with throughput and mining rewards here, okay? But if you want to raise higher R, that might hurt you because you're going to have a negative effect in terms of how many transactions you can support on the blockchain because you're taxing people essentially. And that's going to be important to understand the feasibility. And I don't have much to say at the end, but I think there's lots of implications about feasibility of a blockchain design like Bitcoin. Okay? How am I doing, Bruno? You're doing good. 10 minutes. 10 minutes? Good. Excellent. So let's go down to the decision to double spend. Okay? Good. So it's basically, just look at this particular formula here. Okay? If you look at this particular formula here, it looks almost identical to the problem that you have seen for honest mining. But there's, again, red variables in here. So that's basically your return from mining secretly and double spending. For the sake of it, we use the same cost function. We have other versions. You could put anything in there that you want, but the logic doesn't change, okay? But the key thing here is if you're trying to basically mine a chain of length n plus 1 to undo a particular confirmation in the blockchains of length n, you're going to get all the rewards because you have the longest chain eventually, but you get an extra reward d. And this incentivizes you basically to possibly invest a lot into secretive mining and trying to double spend. Okay? So your problem looks slightly different. Exactly how these, what you can claim back, you can make other assumptions on this D, you can change your probability. We make just, for simplicity, we assume a sequence of sequential races, not a Poisson race. You can change that. We have done this in the paper as well. And then basically, it doesn't affect the logic of this result. It just changes the exact mathematical formulation of the result. But a buyer has no incentive to double spend if this particular problem with your optimal investment doesn't give you any extra return. So in essence, is basically negative, okay? And so we're going to use that. We can basically then solve this decision of double spending separately here, taking as given the global parameters of the reward and the particular contract that is out there. And we basically can derive a constraint that will tell us under what condition there's no double spending in this world. And under my assumption, I get the easiest constraint that I can come up with, okay? You can change model parameters and do other things, but the shape of the constraint, the qualitative result doesn't change. So this constraint basically says there's not going to be double spending on any transaction if the transaction size is relatively small compared to confirmation like n and compared to the particular return r that you put out there, okay? So qualitatively, what's going on is and that's very intuitive. You will all agree on this, I guess. If the transaction size D goes up, more incentives to double spend. If R goes up, less incentive to spend if there are more rewards. If you want to be super safe, require more confirmation legs. Okay? Now, I'm more like of a payments guy. I'm more of a financial economist, a macroeconomist. So the first thing that I get from this equation is actually a very strong result. It might not seem obvious, but it's very strong. Settlement cannot be both immediate and final. The beauty of cash is it's final and immediate. Okay? So Bitcoin will never ever be able to replicate this unless you accept double spending. But what does double spending mean? Even in 100 years from now, it's probabilistic settlement, and that's a big problem. Okay? So if you want to settle large value payments on the blockchain, you better think twice, possibly. Okay? There's a reason why we do this as a central bank. Okay? But it's also interesting because N follows a power law here to react to the constraint, or the social cost is just linear. Okay, good. So what do we do then? Never mind this lemma. I don't want to talk about this. This is a technical condition to rule out mutual beneficial double spending. It's just some weird thing going on as a potential here economically in our quantitative exercise that's never going to happen. But essentially, we're going to solve a very simple problem, okay? And that's the nuts and bolts. We solve like maximize total surplus, taking the parameters as given, which is mu, the seigniorage, the fees tau that you have to pay, the total R that's out there as a reward, and you basically solve for the optimal transaction in this particular Bitcoin protocol, general equilibrium, okay? And so we get a particular result out of that. But let me go on. Once you subscribe to this double spending constraint, which basically summarizes everything in terms of the cost of the protocol at the end of the day, if you want to be super safe, you want to basically put rewards out there and rely on people in terms of their confirmation legs to be super safe, okay, and not have any double spends. That's going to cost the cost of the system. What we can now do is doing really what we're calling a Ramsey problem in economics. We can basically say like maximize social welfare subject to people doing these decentralized transactions without double spending in this world, okay? And so this objective function is important because it picks up both things. It picks up the transaction value by using this means of payment. That's the first two terms across all transactions. That's why there's an integral. But then it also picks up the cost that you have. Why? Because you tax people through inflation, you tax people through transaction fees, and all these things go into this mining investment, and you blow it up as hot air into the atmosphere. And that's basically the cost of running this particular system. That's the last term. And we take this exactly into account. If you take this into account, you get actually the interesting result is that you want to use seigniorage and a particular transaction level of transaction fees. And there's something else in the background. You get also the optimal R, how much hash rate you want to have. So that gives you a lot of ideas about what seigniorage you actually want to charge here. But we don't have a closed form solution for that, okay? So we have to do some quantitative solution. What's the intuition? That might be interesting to you to understand, okay? There's actually two reasons, okay? The first reason is you're basically taxing where it hurts the most. Just think about it. You have to raise a certain tax revenue. But if you don't have seigniorage and only transaction fees, you raise it from people that make transactions. Not everybody makes transactions in Bitcoin. That means your tax base is smaller. You have to tax a smaller number of people, but that means you have a higher tax rate, which is much more distortionary, okay? Think about only taxing people that work really, really hard to raise all the tax revenue. You have to tax them double the amount, okay? If you don't want to tax anybody else in the economy. That's kind of the idea. Good, I'm clearing time. The second one is a different reason. So it's kind of a technical reason, because even if sigma is equal 1, even if you want to tax, everybody has always a transaction, you tax everybody. What's also going on here is that the no double spending constraint is tighter if you use fees. And the reason is with a double spend, you can do both. You are not only reclaiming the payment to the seller, you also reclaim basically the payment that was offered as a fee, as a block reward as well. You appropriate that. And that makes it actually a tighter constraint. So there's actually two reasons for doing that. And first we didn't realize that, and then a referee says like, I don't understand, and you have to dig deeper and you figure things out as you go. Okay? So that's kind of interesting. Now let's come to basically my last slide here. So what are we doing in terms of, so we wanted to figure out how well can a cryptocurrency function as a means of payment. So far we only basically have a status quo. We have a model, a structural model, and what we do in economics with a structural model, we abstract from a lot of details and says this is the true world. And then we're going to use numbers to basically estimate or calibrate the model, and then we get a quantitative answer of something unobservable, which is like the total cost of using Bitcoin as transactions, okay? So that's what we're doing in economics. And then we compare it to some benchmark to get a handle on it. And exactly that's what we're doing here. If you wonder why we call this Thundercoin, because if my friends figured out I'm working on this, it's like they were all choking, so like, are you gonna put out Thorcoin? It's like, no, it's not cool enough, so let's call it Thundercoin. So that's why it's Thundercoin up there. And so what we're doing is we're gonna run two benchmarks, and then we compare it against certain measures. So one is the Bitcoin benchmark, which is like a 2016 calibration. Why? Because we had a fixed block reward and things like that, and we didn't have like price bubbles going on and crazy things. So that's why we used 2016. And then we're gonna use our optimal Bitcoin policy. Now look at the optimal Bitcoin policy that we figure out in the structure of our model given the transaction data from 2016. So it has actually an inflation rate of 0.4 and no transaction fees, okay? So it's a very benign inflation rate, okay? But right now in 2016, the annualized inflation rate would be about 10%. The fees turned out to be 0.008%, so a very small fraction only. But the losses are pretty much massive, okay? So let's figure out where these losses come from, okay? So first, in the benchmark, the losses are very high because we're rewarding people too much in the system right now. So in other words, our incentive constraint is so slack. Nobody wants to double spend. Why? Because it's utopic to be successful. But you could still have a no binding double spending constraint with lower block rewards. That's kind of the interesting thing. So it's too safe, the system. That's the problem. The second thing is also, what you have to pick up is that you're super safe for what? Probably the largest transactions in the network. But the largest transactions in the network have the highest incentive to double spend. So if you lump together coffee transactions with Ferrari transaction at $1 million transfers, you have a problem. Because you have to make the system super safe for the $1 billion transfers, and transacting for Bitcoin or for a coffee or so doesn't matter. Okay, good. But the interesting part is also Bitcoin is fairly expensive actually if you take these large and small transactions together and put it like in the optimal system, which much more linear grows, it's still very expensive. Okay? So, and the reason there comes in, it's the inflation. We compare it to an inflation rate of 2% that you face in the US, that you face in Europe, a little bit less maybe, but that's the stated objective of the ECB. It's still very expensive, and the expensive comes from two facts. Number one, what does the ECB do? The ECB makes profits from seigniorage, but reimburses people for that in a sense. We call them lump sum transfers, okay? You can reduce other taxes, okay? In Bitcoin, it's just heat, goes up in smoke. And the second thing is you have delay. The beauty of cash, and we're looking at a cash economy, is immediate settlement. You don't have delay. So they have these two extra costs, and they can still be massive. Now, but let's put this also into perspective, you know? We're basically saying it's a threat. It's a threat to whom? To Venezuela, who doesn't have a functioning currency system. So, you know, you accept like an inflation rate of, or like a cost of 65 times the cost of a monetary system in the US or in Europe if you're facing an inflation tax that's massive, right? So if we calculated in break-even inflation tax and in the optimal Bitcoin system that we have set up, you would have about 50% to be indifferent between using the national currency system and Bitcoin for making everyday transactions. Okay, perfect. And that's pretty much what I have to say. As I said, there's a lot of other technical stuff in the paper to close all these loops and things like that. I haven't talked about them at all. But what to take away here? I think the nice thing, what we found about this paper is that we're kind of having this holistic view. So we take it kind of as serious what the incentive problems with a distributed ledger are, and the incentive problems are stealing, okay? And stealing, I mean like not, you know, a malicious attack to bring the system down. No, you want to double spend, okay? That's defrauding people on the blockchain, okay? We take this seriously. We basically develop a constraint that captures this problem as a hard constraint to basically rule it out. We show that this constraint is not costless. It is basically the main cost driver in the Bitcoin system. And then you have to design the reward structure of a cryptocurrency such that you can finance these rewards in a proof of work system. And that all comes back, okay? And then basically we have this, we can give a sharp answer, we think, in terms of how well or how expensive it is to use Bitcoin as a payments system, okay? And that I think was valuable for us because we kind of get a relatively sharp answer to that, a relative transparent answer where these costs come from, what the costs are. And we can talk about the costs, right? We can talk about maybe the constraint is loose, maybe it's tighter, whatever. The philosophy of how to figure this out doesn't change. So the machinery stays the same. The exact form of the constraints and the exact numbers, you can put different things in, okay? So that's it. All right. Have I spoken fast enough to catch up? That's great. Okay, good. Excellent. Yeah. So we have actually a proof of stake formulation where we basically assign voting rights to everybody on the blockchain according to the currency holdings. And again, you can acquire more currencies that you need for transactions to make a transaction, get a higher voting rate, and basically cheat as well. We have an extension. That's what we label proof of stake. The cost is going to go down. But there's, right now, my point of view, I'm not a computer scientist, I mean, the beauty of the proof of work protocol is that from an economics perspective, you do something very, very costly. You burn stuff. And that makes it kind of super safe. I mean, you know, there's proof of burn that you can solve for the next highest prime number and stuff like that. But then the mathematician that's interested in that has a lower threshold, basically to cheat. So there's always like a back thing coming in proof of stake, you know. You have all kinds of other problems, nothing at stake problem, people trying to solve that. You have long run and tax problems and things like that. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't know this particular protocol. Yeah. 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 I don't know the Algorand protocol. Yeah. So we have done this also because this is particular to a cryptocurrency. We have a different world as well, a different paper. Bruno knows it, where we basically trying to settle asset trades with a smart contract and atomistic transactions. And the double spending problem becomes much more severe because defaulting means just deleting a block. And we have looked at these type of things. So it goes both ways. Different algorithms for cryptocurrencies, but also the situation changes. What you're using a cryptocurrency for settlement or for a real transaction or for like, a holistic, like a bilateral transaction, DVP in a settlement system like financial trades. There were some other questions.
So it seems there's a bit of an implicit assumption, which is continuity. So once you have done the double spending attack, there still exists enough interest in using the cryptocurrency as a means of payment. So now the thing is that as you have a very long confirmation time, let's say, and you do a double spending attack, that seems to be something that's detectable, which is a threat to the blockchain as a whole and the usage of the system, right?
Yeah, no.
So if this, and so because one issue is that you have these additional payments that you get every time you in your double spending attack. But if that is all for naught, then...
Oh, sure. So I think, the paper has been presented in many places. And just on Friday, we had another presentation on a different continent, and somebody else pointed that out. You're correct. But that just shows up in my double spending constraint. It's very simple. But just put an f, a function of d on the left-hand side, put a g of r and n on the right-hand side. You can assume something like, oh yeah, you're going to lose half of the value if it's detected because people lose confidence and things like that. It will relax it, but the philosophy of the argument doesn't change. The number is 5 with a 65 times. There's a little, that depends on this particular functional form, but that's it, right? So, yeah, but you could do also smart attacks. Apparently, somebody said this as well. You can basically short Bitcoin simultaneously and raise your rewards, right? So it would go the other way. It would tighten it and things like that. So crazy things, you could design crazy attacks from an economics perspective, okay? There were other...